Thank you very much. We're lucky enough to have a representative from industry in the form of Vicky Bowman. Vicky, maybe you could tell us about practical companies' practical experience of those schemes and the value, really what they achieve in terms of increasing transparency. Okay.
Thank you very much, and thank you also, European Voice, for organising a multi-stakeholder platform here, which is very much in the spirit of EITI, with business, with the regulator, with the NGOs there. Like Reinhardt, we do take a long-range view on this, and I'll go through in a minute and show what we've been doing voluntarily as a company in terms of publishing the payments we make to government, because we absolutely do see the case for transparency as being in our interests as a business. We are also, though, concerned about the burdens if one goes into a level of detail which requires us, in effect, to rewrite our accounting systems, because we don't see that as being the objective of the proposal. The objective is to, as Simon Taylor pointed out earlier, to combat corruption and deal with the cars. It's not about new accounting mechanisms. What I wanted to show you is where we are as a company, because this is obviously relevant to the debate. We are global, but until recently we were largely concentrated in OECD countries, and in particular in Australia, which is still the source of some 70–80% of our revenues, above all from iron ore right now. But we are around the world and currently expanding in Mozambique, in Guinea, in Mongolia. Those are very big projects. We're also in South Africa, Namibia, Zimbabwe, Madagascar, Peru, Chile, Brazil, and so on. So these are countries around the world where we have worked, in particular with EITI, to build the capacity of the local government and supply them with the data that under EITI they require. But we're also delighted that now Australia and the US have said that they will sign up and pilot EITI, because we see it as being a standard or an initiative which should cover the developed countries just as it covers the developing, because the issues of accountability should be the same. This is the taxes paid report that we brought out in May this year, and it was an upgrade to what we've done previously under our sustainability reporting, because we recognised the Publish What You Pay and others campaigns for something that was easier to use. So it's a standalone report which seeks to both set out country by country anywhere where our payments to government are above $1 million, and I'll show you what that looks like, but also then in other pages it sort of backs that data into our annual reports, because without boring you with accounting detail, and that's not my specialty, EITI is a cash-based reporting system, and usually companies' financial reports are based on accruals. What we've tried to do is make it actually understandable so that you can see that we're not sort of fiddling the figures, how the two match up. But what this shows, above all, as I said, is the amount of tax that we pay, and in particular tax that we're paying in developed countries, Australia, US, and Canada. But equally, it throws up for you how much tax and royalties we've paid in a country like Indonesia, where I think the figure is something like 333 million. One of the points about this is that is attributable for us to a single operation, which, if you want, you can call it a project. The problem that we have as a mining company is actually projects for us in our internal definition are when the geologist is out in the field. It's usually something that's not generating any money and not paying any taxes. So when Dodd-Frank said, why don't you just call or define a project the way you call a project, we said, well, that doesn't mean anything to us. We then sat down with some of the oil and gas and other mining companies, and they all found, even within their companies, that they had 33 different definitions of how they used the word project. So where I think business is wanting to sit down with the Parliament is to discuss this issue of definitional detail. It's not that we disagree on the objectives at all. It's that actually, we've just spent the last 3 months trying to kick around, is there a way of defining project that makes sense across all our businesses, across all our sectors? But to go back to Indonesia, if you are sitting in West Papua and you want to know how much tax Rio Tinto has paid to the Indonesian government as a consequence of our participation in the Grasberg mine, which is actually run by Freeport-McMoRan, but we have a share in it, that's the figure that you're looking at. So it is associated in many of these countries on a one-to-one basis. Zimbabwe. That's our Maroa Diamonds mine. There are no other operations in Zimbabwe. So the figures that you're getting there, I think, are the figures that the Commission and others here are seeking to achieve. But they're reported here on a country-by-country basis. We can actually, and we do, report by some of our businesses, because that's the way we report as a company. And we're more than willing to do this. But this is not something that necessarily other companies will sort of wire themselves up to report in this way. So you can see some of our major Australian businesses. And again, the figures, as I say, are not identical. The Grasberg figure here, because this is an accruals basis. The previous page was cash. To pick up the point about the not having legislation which requires EU-listed companies to get their employees to break the law, I think this is important just as a matter of, again, as a matter of morality, that we should not be putting our employees at risk. For us, we haven't faced this problem, but other companies, and Shell, who is our sponsor tonight, has faced this problem in Cameroon, Qatar, and China. So it does seem to be a real problem that they've encountered, and that's why we are grateful that the Commission has recognised that in the proposal. What we're certainly not trying to do, and I know it's a concern, and it's a concern for us, is encourage countries to introduce legislation that would make it illegal or criminal to disclose this information. Far from it. But where we would like there is for the NGOs, for governments, for donors to maintain the moral pressure on those governments to continue in the trajectory towards greater transparency, towards more countries signing up to EITI. But as I say, ultimately, safety of our employees is key, whether they're working on a mine site or whether they're sitting in an office, and we don't want them to be put at risk there. I know that Reinhard has been a rapporteur for the raw materials dossier in the Parliament, and one of the issues that we've kicked around is whether or not there is any risk that as EU-listed companies become more transparent, they may be excluded from markets where those countries, although they may not have criminal legislation or anything on transparency, just may regard EU companies are too much hassle to deal with because they have all of these tedious transparency requirements. So I do think we have to bear in mind that we may, if we don't get a global playing field in which Chinese companies and other companies are covered, we may find that EU companies are excluded from those markets where there are strategic raw materials that the EU and the rest of the world needs. I think I'll stop there and open up myself to questions and debate. Thank you.
Okay, thanks very much, Vicky. Claire, maybe we could come to you first to sort of pick up some of the points there. I mean, obviously, in drafting this proposal, the revision of the directive, you've grappled with the issue of the balance in terms of reporting requirements. Maybe you could tell us a little bit about the Commission's, a little more about the Commission's thinking there, and also this issue of an exemption for countries where disclosure would be a crime. Seems, Mr. Butikofer has highlighted it, at least a risk of a loophole in the legislation.
Yeah, okay. Maybe I should take... Working? Maybe I should take that one first. I think I wouldn't be giving away any secrets to say that this came in rather late in the process, in the discussion process. I think fully understand your concerns about that one in terms of we definitely don't want this to have the opposite effect, which is to go around encouraging other countries to make this a crime so that they can get out of it. I mean, you said, are there any examples? I think Vicky gave a few. What we're going to have to do is to look into those examples and see how serious they are. But I fully take your point on that one. I had quite a heated discussion with my colleagues about it this morning, actually, because when I looked at it, I pretty much had the same reaction as you in terms of making sure that this isn't a massive loophole. Materiality, Reinhard, you mentioned as well. You said this is going to be left to the delegated act. Well, I would say from the Commission's point of view, we're open to putting something clearer on this. If in the discussions we can work out perhaps around some kind of threshold that makes sense as a starting point. But the one thing I would argue that is we should leave ourselves some flexibility to be able to adapt that down the road, because if we have to go back through the whole legislative process again, if we find that we don't calibrate that properly, which I think there may well be, that there are challenges there, let's say. But we're certainly open to going into more what the materiality means and setting some parameters for that, and indeed some kind of numerical threshold, if that makes sense. But we need then a procedure afterwards which will be able to adjust relatively flexibly as and when things evolve. And then lastly, people have mentioned this question as well of project. How exactly do we define the project? Again, that was a difficult one to strike the balance. The current text leaves quite a lot of flexibility, I would say, to companies about what they call a project. It may be that we need to go a bit further than that in terms of how we look at it. But the challenge was, for example, somewhere like Canada, if we're talking about logging, on the forestry side of things, and then we talk about the lease or concession, then what would happen is that there would have to be thousands of disclosures, which won't necessarily make it that meaningful in terms of people who are looking at the information either. So I think I'll limit it to those 3 points, if that's okay.
Okay. Who'd like to come in on some of the points? Simon?
Sure. Am I switched on again?
Yeah, you're right.
How to respond? I'm struck by the American term Groundhog Day, if you pardon the expression. If I think of all the regurgitated arguments I've been listening to since about 2000, 2001, I'm very strongly reminded about that in the context of the idea around exemptions. It seems to me that is an absolute red rag to the bull. It is a license to the very countries we're talking about to write themselves a nice piece of legislation making it illegal. That's exactly what I would do if I was President Dos Santos. So by creating an exemption, which I would say was the call of the American Petroleum Institute before 1504 was passed, and it's not a feature of 1504, and we hope that the SEC in its rulemaking phase won't introduce it. But exactly the same point was asked, and it was placed at that point in the context of, we can't possibly have this because this will put American companies at a disadvantage. So here we are, and I noticed that in the blurb at the beginning of this. They're also concerned that disclosure rules that only apply to EU-based companies would give an advantage to their global competitors, damaging EU competitiveness. Why is this all about EU companies? This is about companies listed and non-listed, but in the EU. They include foreign companies. Just as in the United States, there's actually many more companies of a serious global scale affected by the US legislation alone than there are American companies, because a lot of the companies we like to think of are listed in America at the same time, and they include Chinese companies as well. So I think the objective here should be, how do we create a global standard, not why do we think of all the problems in getting there and let's duck back under cover. Because if we create an exemption, what we'll have created is a load of bureaucracy to require a disclosure mechanism that will be little better than having EITI. In other words, we might as well just carry on with EITI. Love EITI though I do, and we are full participants and absolutely supportive of EITI. I see the two as complementary. But somebody here needs to give me an idea of how we get the worst despots into the room in a meaningful way in a process like EITI. And we've been doing this now for 11 and a half years. And I would put to anyone who thinks that we should wait another 11 and a half years, what do you say to the people of Equatorial Guinea who are now on the verge of an oil peak, if not already, their oil output's declining, maybe it can come up a bit. They should have a per capita income of Denmark, and yet they're literally on nothing. And there's no change of leadership coming unless we have a Libya situation, and don't count your chickens anytime soon. How long do these people have to wait before they can expect to have exactly what we take for granted? It's just a non-starter. So, Vicky, you mentioned Shell's position on Cameroon, Qatar. They also mentioned Angola, which I thought was rather funny, because Angola, just so people know, was precisely the reason why we launched Publish What You Pay as a call on listing authorities in the first place, because actually in the Angolan PSAs that we've looked at, and we've looked at many of them, it has a clause in there which I can't remember the exact wording, that varies by contract, but effectively words to the effect of except where otherwise required by domestic legislation. And actually, let's say we do get a strong ruling in Europe, surely it would apply to, in the Shell case, Royal Dutch Shell plc. On what basis is it Royal Dutch Shell plc that is actually the company in the country concerned that's doing the disclosing? So I actually think the whole issue of criminality for people on the ground is a misnomer, because we're talking about the parent company, not the subsidiary. And usually it's the subsidiary, unless anyone has any exemptions to that. Maybe there are a few that I haven't thought of, but mostly it's the subsidiary, a subsidiary company. So if the parent company is doing the disclosing, why is that of any relevance from a criminality point of view to a subsidiary operating in the country? It's a complete misnomer. I get the political consequences. You know, the country X might say, oh, your parent company disclosed, we hate you, we'll be very cross. But let's face it, then you'd have the entire global civil society movement, the Publish What You Pay movement alone is 650 NGOs and growing. You'd have the IMF, the bank, the European Union, the United States, you'd have everybody after you for kicking out companies. And it's not true that we're just talking about European and American companies. We're talking a much wider field. And if we can just push the boulder over the cliff and make this a global standard for real, and let's talk about materiality and other issues and on, but we actually have an opportunity to avoid all these problems. But I think if we start putting bricks up, we're not going to go anywhere.
Okay. Mr. Bajikova.
First of all, of course, I'm not insinuating that the Commission is sort of trying to encourage some dictators or other crooks to write themselves some legislation providing shelter against disclosure. I mean, that's obvious. But
yeah, I didn't take it that way, don't worry.
Just to make sure I'm stating this again. But the text as it stands could still be a loophole. Yeah. And, I mean, at least there should be some idea about how to discourage countries from starting to write such legislation. I don't find anything in that direction. And unless that's happening, at a minimum, I think we will probably find some of these people who have reason to hide what they're doing. And then we found ourselves sort of in a really foolish position. Second issue I just wanted to raise shortly. Vicky, you said that we should watch out that European companies would not be excluded from markets. Simon reacted to that already partially. But, I mean, the very logical structure of the argument sort of sounds very familiar to me. I mean, I've run across this so often. Don't force European companies to be environmentally responsible unless everybody else has to be at least as responsible. Don't force European companies to be climate responsible unless everybody else is too. I mean, the logic of that is very obvious. Nobody can move before everybody else moves. And that's a formula for stasis. That's a formula for sort of sticking to what we got instead of reform. And one of the problems with that is, apart from the logic, that it is not just a burden. I would argue that we could make it an opportunity that to be a leader, companies could profit from, because it's not just sort of a hidden competition behind closed doors. This is something that is playing out in the broad light of the public. Companies who do not own up to their duties could be challenged in the public by legislators, by not only NGOs, but by their customers. So I think the argument to me sounds sort of suspicious. It sounds to me as if this was just another, you mentioned the title of the film, just another return of the perennial, well, at least we're not going to be the leaders. I think we have to be the leaders to force others to follow suit. And I would like to get maybe a better understanding of what you had in mind when you used that, because I don't think that you would sort of be very happy with this sort of non-committal attitude, but you still said it, so maybe I missed your point.
No, what you spotted was the contradiction between sitting on this platform as the one business representative as opposed to the Rio Tinto representative. As I pointed out, we have been, as a company, very much focused on transparency for precisely all the reasons you say, sustainability for precisely all the reasons you say. But I would say, and forgive me, Shell, for saying this, that the mining sector is further ahead than oil and gas in this, and is certainly further ahead than some of the other extractive industries for the very reason that we do have to deal with the stakeholders around our mine site. And for them, transparency, knowing how much has been paid into the central coffers is one of the key issues that they want to know, and we totally agree with that. So I don't disagree with most of what you were just saying, and we as a company certainly would like to show leadership. The point about exemptions and so on, I think, again, it is quite oil and gas specific around production sharing contracts. So, I mean, Shell, as our sponsor, may want to talk a bit about that. I think, Simon, you make a good point that it's not the guys sitting in Luanda who are filing the report, but that doesn't stop the government's concern from making life hell for the staff in Luanda. So you're quite right. There is, headquarters does it, but what headquarters does can have an impact locally.
So I'll let you come back on this, and then I'm going to throw it open to the floor. Oh, sorry, Vicky, did you?
I think, and the other thing is I totally agree on having a global standard. I think we have absolutely nothing to fear from that and a lot to gain from it, providing it is genuinely global. And this is where I would like to see all G20 members signed up to something similar and enforcing it. The positive that one sees in the EITI, generally all the companies, whatever their nationality and headquarters in a country, have been participating in the EITI-based process. So I think that we're seeing companies from countries who perhaps otherwise wouldn't be so up the scale on this are gradually learning that actually transparency is in their interest too. So what I'm saying is I don't disagree with you on a number of points, but I think this point about some exemptions is something that probably Shell in particular, having encountered it, should speak on at a point.
But I think we need to distinguish between what is a political reality and a reality centered around disclosure, because if you have a global standard which is requiring all the players to do it, we don't have that as an issue. I do take issue with, sorry Shell, but I have to say this, I think Shell has gone through a metamorphosis, I have to say, particularly over the change of leadership, in that if we go back in time to around 2001, 2002, in fact, it's too complex really to go into this here, but in 2001, BP declared that it would disclose its revenue payments in Angola and was threatened with being kicked out. It's a very complicated story, but it's not quite what it would seem. The consequences of that enabled us to go back to the beginning of the discussion in early 2000, which was we need a mandatory mechanism to enable and force, in some cases, all the players to disclose. And that was the origin of why we felt politically it was the time to launch Publish What You Pay as a call. And at that point, Shell was the first and for a long time the only company that stood up in quite a few public fora and publicly stated it was in favour of a mandatory mechanism for disclosure. And this is at a time before EITI had any basic principles at all. EITI was a thematic idea when it was launched, and there was no, we'll do it this way or that way. And that all came through the operationalization of EITI. So, and why I take issue really is the change of leadership has really retrenched Shell, in my opinion, and I think I'd speak for much in the civil society side of the debate, in that a lot, when I said Groundhog Day, a lot of the arguments we've been having, we've been having these for 5 years with the American Petroleum Institute, amongst others. And I think one of the problems I have with Shell's position right now is it won't divorce itself from the position of the American Petroleum Institute, which essentially, if I could sum it up, has been to kill 1504. Absolutely kill it. And what's really frustrating about that discussion, if I'm really, I suppose, blatant about it, has been that the intellectual rigor of that discussion has simply been to regurgitate the same arguments we've already discussed. So we've gone through a process of redrafting and redrafting. We created the first stalking horse, if you like, piece of legislation, an idea, back in 2003. It was widely criticized. We incorporated ideas. We didn't understand certain things. We went to talk to people. People gave us suggestions, well, you can't do it like this because of that. And so over the period of years, we changed this form of legislation. And it became a useful baseline from which the original idea, pre the passage of the Cardin-Luger Amendment, or 1504, got created. So it had already incorporated a lot of the ideas. And the frustrating thing about the API position, and I extend that to Shell because Shell, I believe, has been to some extent behind that and certainly won't divorce itself from the API position, has been to regurgitate a lot of these same old ideas which don't really stack up very well. So, you mentioned Cameroon earlier. I find it beyond belief that Cameroon would institute a law like that as a participant of the ITI. I mean, how is that going to happen? I think they'd be out of the ITI pretty fast, which wouldn't do them much good. Angola already mentioned, the whole reason we launched Publish What You Pay was because of the legal framework of PSAs in Angola. I'm not convinced by the China argument particularly. And Qatar, well, is Qatar really going to kick out the company that produces most of its gas? I get the political thing, but I think that's where the politicians come in. That's where, in that case, the FCO should be ringing up the Emir of Qatar and saying, that's not happening. And so should the State Department, and so should all the other European capitals. We're creating a global standard here, guys. This is not, that's how we deal with that side of it.
I'm going to give, if someone from Shell wants, because their position's been referred to so explicitly, wants to speak now, Andrew Vickers will be summing up later on, but if someone from Shell wants to reply now, I'll give you the opportunity. Otherwise, I see there are a few hands up, so I'll open up the floor to questions. Do I see one over there?